The corridors of the imperial palace were not built for private pleasures. They were lined with marble, lit by oil lamps, and threaded with the hush of courtiers who knew better than to speak aloud. One night, a freedman found a ledger hidden under a carved table, a list of names and sums that turned a rumor into a record. In the year 38 of the Common Era, the Emperor Caligula was already famous for gifts and gladiatorial games. Soon, the same name would be recorded in ledgers, petitions, and memos that catalogued practices beyond simple scandal. This episode will trace 5 sexual practices associated with Caligula and show how individual appetite became a tool of power, how secrecy moved into files, and how humiliation was written down as if it were an entry of state. If you watch Histories of Power and want dense investigations, press like and subscribe to follow the next excavation. He arrived as a laughter in the crowd, a face painted on new coins. At home, he concerned servants with curious orders, and his smile could hide something colder. Everything changed after a fever, after voices that returned him different. What follows is not titillation. It is an inquiry into how desire can be bureaucratized. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, a child in shadow and parade, son of Agrippina the Elder and Germanicus, grandson of powerful lineages and of mourning. As a boy, he walked between soldiers, felt their armor against his skin, heard the applause that misread his small skin of play as destiny. In childhood, he learned the language of spectacle and the currency of attention. The first paragraph of his backstory is a memory of sense. Cedar smoke from military tents, the salt wind of the coast, the tinny scent of minted coins warming in the sun as boys ran with banners. He was schooled by tutors who praised phrase and form, while men in the household catalogued alliances in ledgers, copying names into the family archive. In adolescence, he attended banquets where the air tasted of roasted figs and wine, and where his laughter was measured, appraised, and later used. Later, on the island where Tiberius ruled, there were long shadows and a steady cough. Physicians recorded fevers and tremors, and a record now preserved in a scroll shows an episode that contemporary doctors called a crisis. The second paragraph of his origin notes the sound of doors closing, the clack of writing stylus on wax, the burning of incense that could not hide a child's loneliness. His formation was a mix of ritual and restraint, lessons in command intertwined with a sense that the world would answer to bold gestures. Loss arrived as a public sermon and a private wound. When Germanicus died, the public cried, and Caligula learned that grief could be a spectacle to exploit. The last paragraph of the backstory is a detail of tactility, a mother pressing a thin hand to a small cheek, a ring pressing into the palm, and the future emperor learning early that intimacy could be staged as power. In the beginning of his rule, his gestures were read as benevolent. He distributed grain, released prisoners, and staged games that made the city roar. At the Forum, his carriage passed under laurel wreaths, and senators wrote notes praising his largesse. In private audiences, he joked with consuls and joked with freedmen, throwing coins and promises. A dialogue from a banquet that later appears in a fragmented memoir gives a sense of public theater and private calculation. Lucius the freedman said, "You must show yourself as a father to the people." Caligula answered, "I will be more than a father. I will be the sun that warms them." Marcus the guard laughed and added, "You will light the city, Emperor, and we will polish your light." Caligula tilted his head and said, "Do not laugh at those who bow their heads. You will see what power makes of humility." Gaius the physician cautioned, "There is line, Emperor, that health keep it." Caligula waved a hand and said, "Health is for the weak." Lucius retorted, "Then take wine, not power for a night." Caligula smiled and said, "Wine is power when spilled over lives." The room smelled of wax and mulled wine. The bronze cups had a metallic chill, and the drapes absorbed every footstep like a lung. The scene has tactile notes, a dent in a chair where someone sat, a smear of oil on a floor tile, a faint perfume left by a guest. Those early policies hid a logic that would convert favor into accounting and pleasure into ledger. The turning point came like a fever, an interior event recorded in fragments by Tacitus and Suetonius and by the private memorandum of a palace medic named Gaius Severus. One autumn night he fell violently ill, fever, convulsions, and delirium that lasted days. When he woke, he surprised everyone. Physicians described him as pale, but possessed of a new certainty, as if some private rule had arrived at the surface. He began to favor small ceremonies that felt private but were meticulously recorded. In a short scene reconstructed from a servant's diary, a chamberlain named Marcus hesitated and asked, "Emperor, what are these lists for?" Caligula said, "They are proofs, Marcus, proofs of loyalty and of usefulness." Marcus replied, "You test us with favors and commands." Caligula replied, "Yes, and sometimes favors are accounts." Gaius the physician observed, "There is change, doctor, and spirit are not as before." Caligula laughed faintly and said, "Spirit is what the state needs to balance its books." This moment carries sensory cadences, the metallic rattle of tankards, the nickel shine of coins exchanged under palms, the waxy smell of candles, and the dry scratch of stylus on wax. The fever was both medical and symbolic. It closed an old openness and opened an apparatus. What began in whispers became procedure. Private appetites were turned into instruments that disciplined senators, soldiers, and servants. The palace produced ledgers in which favors were notated as receipts, and sexual encounters were recorded as entries of obligation. A ledger entry might list a name, an amount, and a code word that only certain clerks could decode. The system had actors: Macro, the Praetorian prefect who carried orders; Drusilla, the sister whose proximity was both personal and political; Lucius, the freedman who ran errands and kept lists; Suetonius, the secretary who copied memoranda into archives; Cassius Chaerea, the tribune who took notes with suspicion; Seneca, the rhetorician who whispered that dignity could be bought and sold. In a staged conversation at the archive, Suetonius lifted the scroll and asked, "Who will sign these records?" Lucius answered, "The scribe will sign, but the emperor writes with favors." Chaerea said, "This is shameful and will rot the army." Macro replied, "Order must be kept, or the guard will fragment." Caligula cut in softly, "Do not confuse shame with order." Suetonius muttered, "Then what is this, the ledger of persons?" Caligula replied, "It is the ledger of what keeps Rome tidy." The scene smells of dust and ink. The paper had the crispness of new tax lists. The room was cool with the echo of boots, and the taste of iron from blood that had once been shed during executions. The ledger was a procedural instrument, a bridge from private to public. The first of the 5 practices was public pantomime of sexual roles, used to humiliate political opponents. Caligula would stage scenes in amphitheaters and at banquets where a senator or a client was coerced into participating. One evening in the palace, a dignitary named Publius was brought to perform as an actor under the threat of losing his estate. Dialogue from that night shows coercion as a bureaucratic tool. Publius pleaded, "I will not play such farce." A guard replied, "The confiscation order is signed if you refuse." Caligula said, "Play then, or lose house and children." Publius answered, "Then I will play, but Rome will remember." Caligula smiled, "The archive will also forget if the ledger says loyalty." The sensory tableau includes the squeal of sand under boots, the glare of torches, the sour tang of sweat in the crowd, the damp weight of fear in the mouth, and the brittle scrape of a pen when an official recorded compliance. Moment of tension 1. A crowd pressed close, as a noble was forced into costume, the air thick with sweat and lamp smoke, the clatter of a cup falling, the sick sweetness of spilled wine. 2 paragraphs describe the violence of ritual in measured detail and the cold arithmetic of the ledger that turned shame into a tax. The second practice was incestuous favoritism turned ritual. Caligula openly displayed extraordinary affection for his sisters, especially Drusilla. and these relationships were woven into public rites. Courtiers were compelled to offer worship, and coins bore inscriptions that suggested a shrine of intimacy. A conversation in the temple between a priest named Aelius and a clerk named Marcus reveals the administrative overlay. Aelius whispered, "They call her goddess." Marcus replied, "The census records a new cult entry." Aelius said, "Does the Senate authorize this?" Marcus answered, "The Senate sign only when they fear the ledger." The temple stones smelled of smoke and crushed herbs. The cool marble hummed with footsteps. The distant murmur of a crowd like waves, and the faint metallic bite of coins placed on a palm. Moment of tension, 2. A delegation of senators arrived to protest, and the echo of their shoes in the antechamber sounded like marching toward an execution. The priest's hands trembled as he counted offerings, and the clerk erased a line in a ledger with shaking fingers. The third practice was systemic sexual blackmail and exchange. Officials received instructions to procure persons for the emperor or to accept that refusal meant financial ruin. The palace developed a census of availability, a registry that marked names for potential use. In a memorandum later found by historiographer Suetonius, a line reads, "List of useful houses and names to be reserved for the emperor's disposal." Dialogues between a distraught father named Flavius and the scribe Suetonius capture the bureaucratic cruelty. Flavius begged, "Please, not my daughter, she is married." Suetonius read the entry and said, "The ledger says reserved." Flavius cried, "How to pay the bribe?" Suetonius answered, "You will find a way, or the entry becomes law." The sensory world smells of lamp oil and the leathery scrape of a stylus, the cool weight of bronze coins passing through palm, the clump of heavy boots, and the dry taste of fear. Moment of tension, 3. A family argued in the courtyard while a clerk wrote their names. The sky threatened rain, the first drops hissed on hot stone, and the entry was signed while the father clasped his wife's hand as if pleading with a judge. The fourth practice was the manufacturing of sexual spectacle as a political theater. Caligula staged performances where roles of pleasure and humiliation were codified into ceremonies that reinforced his supremacy. Musicians played dissonant chords, and uniforms were arranged to frame those chosen for dishonor. A dialogue between a musician named Quintus and a captain named Marcus shows the mechanization of play. Quintus said, "The score is obscene." Marcus answered, "Our duty is to follow score." Quintus replied, "But we play for pain, not joy." Marcus shrugged, "The ledger rewards those who keep time." The air carried the thud of drums, the metallic smell of armor, the dry, papery whisper of banners, the sour tang of perspiration under heavy cloaks, and the hollow ring of a goblet dropped in surprise. These spectacles were not spontaneous. They had rehearsals, orders scribed in ledgers, and payments recorded in the imperial coffers. The fifth practice was the normalization of the emperor's sexual whims into law and profit. The palace fee system transformed favors into revenue. Guards and clerks took commissions from families, and funds flowed to the treasury or to private pockets. An accountant named Fabius kept 2 ledgers, one official and one secret. In a fragmentary exchange, Fabius muttered, "The official ledger shows nothing." A clerk called Marcus said, "Then the secret ledger must have names." Fabius replied, "Names and numbers, and the pockets of those who record them." Marcus asked, "Who will audit?" Fabius shrugged, "No one while the emperor smiles." The description includes the cold click of coins stacked in a box, the dust motes in a beam of light over a table, the faint smell of mildew in vaults, the heavier scent of human cologne, and the quiet kiss of cash placed into a palm. At roughly a third of this narrative, there is a point where we ask you to respond. If this reconstruction disturbs you, tell us, in one word, which part hit hardest. Choose bureaucracy if the ledger and records shocked you. Choose spectacle if the rituals or public shaming struck you. Choose victim if the human cost moved you most. Leave just that single word in the comments. If you recall a source or a similar case, name it briefly in one line. We read every reply and use it to guide future archives we open. Now, back to the record where a soldier named Chaerea begins a plot, and the private ledger and public theater converge. Resistance grew slowly and in corners. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune noted for grim discipline, complained to a small circle about the erosion of dignity. Conversations in a barracks between Chaerea and 3 soldiers revealed tightened nerves. Chaerea said, "We are mocked on parade." Soldier 1 answered, "They force us to watch and write it down." Soldier 2 said, "Our families pay for silence." Chaerea murmured, "There must be an end." Soldier 3 asked, "How kill a practice?" Chaerea replied, "We strike the man, not the law." The barracks smelled of sweat and leather, the clank of armor, and coffee bitter tea, the low murmur of plotting like water under stone. A small conspiracy took shape. A plan that mixed brute force with legal notes. A way to end a man and hope to erase a system. Moment of tension 4. On the night of the assassination, the palace corridors were wet with rain. Torches stuttered, voices muffled behind tapestries, and a blade found its mark in a room where candles burned low. The assassination was messy and immediate. After Caligula fell, the palace filled with cries and ink-stained hands reaching for ledgers. A hurried exchange between Macro and a panicked scribe named Suetonius shows the scramble to control records. Macro barked, "Seal the archives now." Suetonius stammered, "Which ledgers?" Macro answered, "All of them. Lock them or burn them." Suetonius whispered, "The people will look for proof." Macro said, "Proof will be scattered." The sensory impression includes the acrid smell of smoke when pages burned, the metallic taste of fear in mouths, the sharp slap of sandals on wet stone, and the cool quiet after screams. The immediate consequence was both public relief and administrative chaos. The palace attempted to erase lines, but paper had been copied to distant hands, and the ledger's echoes survived in provincial files. The legacy stretched beyond the fall. In 1 month, the city attempted normalcy. Markets reopened, but whispers traveled like a new wind. 1 quarter later, committees convened to inventory losses and to ponder legal reforms. By 6 months, the memory hardened into law review and into the way officials recorded favors with more caution or less audacity. The epilogue traces those intervals in detail. After 1 month, ordinary life returned. Delimiters and rituals resumed in smaller scale. Markets filled with the smell of bread and soaked wool, cooks called orders, and families rehearsed how to tell children about an emperor as a cautionary tale. After 3 months, the Senate had convened a panel to audit palace registers, a committee that copied surviving pages into municipal archives and that interviewed clerks and freedmen. The sensory tableau of the audit was the cool hush of the archive room, the chalked tally marks on a slate, the whisper of fingers turning brittle paper, the sour smell of old ink, and the steady tick of a sundial outside. After 6 months, reforms were proposed, but many practices had moved underground. New ledgers used different codes, and fees were renamed as contributions. The economy captured some of the flows, and private pockets retained others. The longer-term legacy was not simple erasure. Institutions adapted, some officials were punished, others were promoted, and some documents survived to become proof of what a state could do. This inquiry depended on ledgers and on voices, those preserved by historians like Suetonius and Tacitus, on fragments in archives, and on memos copied by secretaries and later recovered. We named clerks and guards and senators and conspirators because institutions are made of people who write, sign, and obey. The pattern is clear. An individual appetite can be transmuted into procedure when the state records it, when the ledger legitimizes it, when officials are rewarded for compliance. The moral is not a sermon, but a caution. Records carry memory and power. The ability to measure shame turns cruelty into policy, and the apparatus of administration can make private violence durable. If this excavation through ledgers and ritual disturbed you, consider subscribing.
If you value meticulous archives and deep reconstructions, subscribe to follow the next investigations, where we will open specific files, discuss manuscripts, and interview historians who study these ledgers. Share the video if you think more people should see how systems of power can codify private whims. The empire changed its face, but not all of its practices. Names were erased from walls, but persisted in voices and in coffers. The ledgers remind us that the worst part is not the appetite
itself, but the way bureaucracy turns appetite into policy, into income, into habit. Institutions outlive individuals and sometimes carry forward the procedures that normalized humiliation. The records remain to be read and judged by us. If there is one final thought, let it be this: institutions can survive men, but man-made manuals of cruelty may not be so easily burned. Thank you for watching.